Hey there, everybody. This is Phoenix Aurelius. Thank you for joining us for this Alchemi-Culture episode. Today, we're talking with one of my very good friends and a colleague, Lindsey Scharmyn. She is the hostess of RogueWays, also of Middle Path. She's an author. She's an artist. She does about half a dozen different types of things really well, including creating organized jewelry and tarot readings and guided journeys. Is that what you would call them, Lindsey?
I do that as well, yes.
Yes, exactly. And so many other things. You may have actually even learned about my work through Lindsey. So it's really an awesome opportunity for her to be able to come on my show now and just return the favor and pay back the love. So anyway, Lindsey, thank you so much for joining us today. How's it going?
Very, very good. I'm having a very high energy, good day. Somebody told me it's numerologically a 22 day, which is like a special master number. And I'm supposedly a 22 life path. So it's like my day. So it's a really good time to be here. And it's awesome to come on your show now after you've been on my show so much. I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, I'm really excited about it too. We've got a lot of catching up to do in that regard. So, yeah, one of the things, first of all, you're an author, right? And you were an author even before you started RogueWays, is that right?
Yes. I mean, I've basically been a writer my whole life. And then I started publishing my work via blogs probably circa 2010 or so, 2009. But before that I had written poetry and I'd written kind of articles here and there, and especially political articles and essays. And I started blogging and publishing my experiences because I did a lot of traveling and teaching in weird places. And, people wanted to know what it was like and what it was about. So I started doing that. And then someone suggested I kind of collect one specific year of blog posts, which was when I was teaching on a Native American reservation in the middle of absolutely nowhere and far, far, far from civilization, and publish it as sort of a memoir. And so I did that first. And that was my first official sort of book that I wrote.
Oh, that's cool. Is it still in publication?
Yeah, it's called a Gypsy on the Res, and it's very irreverent and sort of saucy. It was a really emotionally impactful time because I have Native American heritage, and it was never really a part of my upbringing because my father had a closed adoption, and I was kind of like, shuffled into this white family in this white community, and it was all like under wraps, sort of like, don't nobody pay attention to the fact that he's from a Native American family and tribe, and so that was all just sort of cut off. And we just didn't get to know. We still don't know anything about that side of our lives. And so it was interesting for me to have known that and known that growing up and not been connected with it, and then go live on a reservation and really get intimately, connected with these kids, who was also my first year teaching, which is always terrifying and horrible. And so that's all mixed up in there too. And so it's a really fun and kind of deep, profound, emotional, irreverent look at all of that. It's pretty
Wow,
fun.
that's amazing. So I have two thoughts that I really wanted to unpack there. The first, have you basically sold your DNA rights away by getting a DNA test yet by any of the major companies?
Okay, I haven't, but my brother did. And so I don't know how that works, but it was very interesting because what we found was that our genetic profile tends to have a lot of sort of Asian, native Asian, but also native North European. And that is not from my mom's side. That side is all kind of Germanic and that sort of area of Caucasian, but this is, I think we might actually be from the Sami people of Northern Europe, which are Asian in
Yeah.
genetic profile. So that was actually much larger. And then we have a tiny slice of kind of North American native, if I remember correctly, but a lot smaller than we expected. So it was interesting to learn that actually maybe he was still of this tribe and still, from a parent in that area, but mostly genetically, possibly Sami or otherwise
Yeah,
Asian.
exactly. Other kind of Mongoloid
Right.
tribe. Wow, that is absolutely fascinating. So the second thing that I wanted to unpack around that was that you're a teacher, and
Yes.
you what grades do you like to teach?
6th through 12th are my area of expertise and certification, but it's like I really love, I don't know, I can't pick a grade. I love them all. They're really, each of them has their own unique sort of
That's true.
personality and struggles, but I really love 6th graders because they're still so tiny and awkward and funny. And I learned to love seniors a lot. In my last 4 or 5 years teaching, I worked mostly with seniors, and that was really, really cool because they're right on that cusp. They're about to go out into the world and
Yeah,
be themselves. And it's very interesting to watch them go through that reorientation.
that's really awesome because both 6th and 12th grade are kind of major initiation points. You have like a lot of 11 and 12-year-olds in the 6th grade kind of, class and genera. And like you said, it's so funny because it's such an awkward phase. Most of them are hitting puberty, and you have these really interesting personalities that are growing into young teenagers while at the same time still having all of these kid attributes. It's really fun to be able to see that transition. Then you have the same thing happening in 12th grade with your seniors who are, like, I'm a teen, I'm a kid, don't make me do that, mom. And then all of a sudden, have tons of responsibility on their shoulders and starting to prep for college and getting an quote unquote idea of the real world. It's that would be really fun to be able to, from a teacher's perspective, see an entire class of students, go through that transition year over year over year. And yeah, that'd be very enriching. So how'd you get into teaching in the first place?
Well, when I was young, especially when I hit middle school, I had just gone through just so much trauma, and I was very, very angry and emotional and like hateful and just all over the place, and I needed a lot of love. And I was very lucky to live in a community where I got a lot of love, and I still didn't stop me from going through what I was going to go through, but it was a really nice cushion and backdrop with which to try and process all of this. And so I really learned intimately how important adults are in the lives of children. And because children spend so much of their time in public education, teachers obviously become
Yeah,
one of those very important adults. And I saw the damage that was done by the multitude of teachers who didn't really care that much. I mean, most of them care somewhat, but very few of them care deeply enough to really
yeah,
try and be there for you emotionally. And that's a hard job. So I don't necessarily blame everyone, but there's just a lot of pretty bad teachers out there. And I just saw how many
true.
of my friends were harmed by that. And then I saw the few that were so good and so loving and so supportive, and how much good was done for myself and all of my friends by that. So I very early on decided I wanted to be a teacher. And part of the process of that was not just seeing that and understanding, what a teacher could be for students, but I also had this thought process where I knew I was going to have to pick a profession of some kind. And I knew that I couldn't do anything that I felt like harmed anyone or anything. I just understood this about myself. I need money, but I also have to do something that helps and doesn't harm. And when I looked out at the world, all I saw was harm being done in all of these different ways. And very few professions, it seemed to me, did good and didn't do harm at the same time. And I kind of came down to nursing and teaching were the two. And I knew I couldn't be a nurse because I couldn't like touch people's body fluids and, wipe their butts for them, basically. Because I'm very squeamish in that way. And so I was like, well, it's teaching then. And that was part of the process as well. So it was kind of both were equal, impetus for me to go that route.
That's cool. Now, with your writing background, do you primarily teach like language arts, or yeah, so that's what you're.
Yeah, English and social studies are my two endorsement areas, but English is always my
Oh,
preferred.
brilliant that you're a social studies teacher. Oh my God. Do
Yeah.
do any of your students know that you run RogueWays?
Many of them have discovered this. Yes. I don't know which, because I did a RogueWays for my last year of teaching. My last year and a half of teaching or so, I was doing shows, and one of them being RogueWays, and the other one it wasn't really my own show. It was kind of like a show about another show. And it's kind of like how I started doing shows and podcasting. And then I was like, wait, if I'm doing this, why don't I just do my own show? And
Yeah.
that's part of how RogueWays started. But I was doing it during that year, but I was very, very careful to keep it separate because it's very dangerous, even to publish books or have a
Yeah.
blog or do anything public when you're a teacher, because if you have one thing that the community disagrees with, you are now going to be crucified and
Yeah.
attacked and suppressed. So I tried really hard to keep all those worlds separate, and I succeeded for the most part. But once I was done teaching, somehow people found out. A lot of students have shown up in the chat from time to time.
You're like, oh, this isn't awkward at all.
Yeah. It's funny because I think some of them are like, oh, of course she would be doing this. Of course she would. And others are like, what? These are the things you thought all along? Because as a teacher, I always had this sort of sacred duty feeling that your students should never know your political or your social orientation or even your sexual orientation or really anything except that you love them and you would like to help them learn how to think.
Yeah.
And everything else should be private, not because I don't think they kind of deserve to know or what, it's just because I don't want to influence their choices in life. I just want to help them be able to evaluate and then analyze and determine their own route without me being any kind of influence on that at all otherwise. And so I always tried really hard for them to never know. And it was hilarious when they would try to guess, oh, Miss Brown, you're a vegan, aren't you? You're a vegan lesbian. I'm like, no, but
what? No. No. How would you come to that conclusion?
Right. They'd be like, oh, she's totally a Trump supporter, or like, oh, she loves, Democrats or whatever. They just try to guess, and they were always never, ever anywhere close. But it was kind of an honor then, right? Because then what they were really saying is like, I see myself in you. And I'm like, good,
Yeah.
you should.
Yeah, totally. Or even just getting an idea of social archetypes of where, the different camps that people can fit so that they know kind of how to organize it. And that,
Yes.
That's a good skill. It can also be a detriment if you rely on that too much, because that's where, putting people in boxes ends up kind of biting you in the ass, later on in life. But where they're at, that's an important skill to develop.
That's true.
So yeah, that's got to be interesting. So I was going to ask about, teaching social studies in particular. How do you approach something like that in the modern era? I mean, when you and I went to school, things were pretty crazy. We were learning about all sorts of stuff. I mean, I remember when I was a pretty young kid, I was in grade school, definitely before junior high somewhere, and Bill Clinton and the Lewinsky whole kerfuffle arrived, and those were seen as crazy. But hell, the last 6 to 10 years have just been nothing but nuts. So how do you even approach that as a teacher these days?
Well, I had really very few times that I actually taught social studies. So it was one of my endorsements and I could teach it, but I was always in English positions.
Got it.
Which made me happy. I honestly like it better. But though I taught middle school social studies 1 year, and it was ancient civilizations, which is awesome.
That's
so
cool.
And I approach social studies primarily from the experiential. And so we did a lot of like simulation and putting together, skits and these sorts of things. And so we would read a lot of content, and then we would create some way to sort of experience aspects of what it would have been like. So that was really fun. And especially with middle schoolers, like they're all about doing things instead of just sitting there and like regurgitating. So it was very cool. But in high school, I did teach civics 1 year. And it was a really ironic choice to give me that class because my idea of being a good citizen is very different from other people's. And the canned curriculum that we have for these things is so dumbed down, and it's so minimal on the role that it gives to the citizen, the words it uses to describe that, and the activities that it ascribes to this they're very shallow and meaningless. And so I again tried to make it much more interactive and immersive, and I was trying to encourage basically these projects where we would find actual real community issues and then try to figure out how to solve them, not always through the government, but through other ways too. And that this is part of your civic duties to be involved in your community and understand your ability to work within your community with or without your local government, and to focus on that instead of all the going up to the state and the federal and these other levels. I still wanted them to understand what the function of those levels was supposed to be, but also not necessarily rely on them or feel like that's your only option. And so I was also in a school with a high rate of apathy and, dropout and drug abuse and all of these things. So I was not as successful in getting us to actually do these things, but that was my attempt and my approach. And, there was some there were some cool outcomes of it, but it was a bit too ambitious for that specific setting, I think.
I bet so. But you know, you never know how the impact many years later can play out in those kids. They may have, you know, not really paid attention or even showed up some of the time, but just your presence and overall attitude and approaching things could come in later in life in ways that, you know, you lose contact with all the students, of course, or at least most of them. So it's hard
Right.
to tell. But that,
Fingers
yeah,
crossed.
yeah, exactly. Well, that's really rad. So are you gonna, it's obviously summertime right now, so you're out, but are you going to be teaching again 2022?
No, I haven't taught now for, I think, 2 full school years, including this one.
Brilliant.
And I'm super happy with that because
Yeah.
I did about 14 years in education, about 10 of them in public education and private education, middle school and high school classroom settings, and then many years in other related sort of auxiliary teaching settings. And it was great and I loved it. And, you know, all those reasons I was drawn to it were beautiful and the experience was beautiful. And I like the effect that I was able to have and the relationships that I had with students was profound. And I appreciate it and love it. But it is like soul sapping and energetically draining on every level, mental, physical,
Yeah.
emotional, you know, and spiritual. And I eventually at the end had to just face that and really accept that maybe I can come back someday, but for a long, long time, I need to just do what I love for me.
Replenish after 14 years of soul sucking.
Yes. And it's not the students. And I always want to make that clear because a lot of people tend to jump to that first, like, oh, yeah, kids are crazy and they'll get you. And
You're
they
like, it's
drive.
not that.
No, I love them. If I could just hang out with kids and like present them whatever we felt like together at any given time, I would love that. It would be great. I would never feel sapped by that. But the way that we've structured education and the amount of work we put on individual teachers is ridiculous. There's no way to do it well and correctly. And that's just too much for me anymore, you know?
Yeah, seriously. Well, let's actually talk about that because, you know, education is one of the things that is most important to me, and it's super huge within the alchemiculture philosophy. In fact, you know, education, government, social well-being, all of the different points that we've brought out about alchemiculture really tie into the education component because as kids are early on, whether they're receiving formal or informal education, they're just like sponges taking things in. So, do you feel that it's more related to the curriculum and the oversight that is seen from the governmental mandate level that inhibits the educational opportunities that kids have today? Is that kind of your own take?
That's a big part of it. I honestly feel like it comes from so many directions at once and they all metastasize together to
Mhm.
this cancer. But
Yeah.
but definitely the push to standardize from a top down structural organization is awful. It's deathly. It completely prohibits creativity and individual ability to respond to every group of kids you have is completely unique and different. And if you're a great teacher, in my opinion, you react and respond to your children that you have in front of you at that moment and their specific needs. And there's a lot of that going around rhetorically, like, oh yeah, we should always be measuring and
Mhm.
responding to what they need, but it's on this like minor micro scale instead of the sort of macro scale. Whereas if I had just this like set of tools in my toolbox as a teacher and I came into this classroom and I said, who cares what grade you are, what age you are, whatever, I'm just going to find out what are you generally interested in? What's the sort of flavor? Each year has their own sort of personality for that
Mhm.
year, and kind of makes me think about Chinese astrology and how that might work. But it's really true. And so what's your sort of this year's sort of flavor and personality? And then what's going on in the world right now, and how can that tie into it, and just sort of craft this curriculum for that would be great. That's how it should be. And that's what I would always try to be doing, but I would always had these pressures to do it this way, do it on this timeline, use this curriculum that we created for you. It's for this grade level. It doesn't matter if they're into it or their skills are there, you just push it on them anyways. And all of this stuff that was very restrictive. I was also very lucky that I often found my way to create my freedom to do a lot of what I wanted to do, or even if I was forced to do a certain thing, I'm like, fine, we're going to do this in my way then. And basically it means we're going to tear this apart, and we're all going to look at how ridiculous it is that we even had to do this.
Yeah.
Which kids also like. So I had some success with that, but that's a big part of it, is that standardization and that top down, this is how you do it for this grade level at this month and this day, and gets ridiculous. That's very limiting for teachers and for students. But another part of that is, I have to also reckon with that. I think that I'm somewhat of a great teacher, if I can, toot my own horn. And I think many teachers aren't in it the same way that I am, where I said before, it was like my sacred duty. Well, really all of it was like my sacred duty. I was like, it's my sacred duty to show up for kids and to be here and to help them learn how to think and how to move into the world as actualized adults. And other people are like, this is a job and you tell me what to do, and then I do it with the kids. And that's a very different orientation than where I was. So for me to describe what I just described and then expect other teachers to do that, I don't know that they would be able to do that, because I don't even know if they understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, seriously. Well, it stops making the teacher position being a vocation, and it starts turning it into a passion, because that's really what you would have for it. You would have to want to put in the emotional component and know how to listen, and inherently do that with the kids that you're working with, and know how to change the educational requirements that might, be somewhat as like a core curriculum, for instance, that can be assimilated into the group, but on their own terms. And that takes a lot of flexibility, but I'm right there with you. I think that there are more than enough people who would be interested in doing that. Most of them lose, like they'll even try and become a teacher, get their degrees, do the teaching thing, and then realize that they were put inside of a box, and that it was a trap, basically, that they suck themselves into. And if they want to do something else, then it's hard to get out of in a lot of ways, because there's the stability and the income, and then you'd have to maybe go to school to learn a new craft, and you've already put so much time into it, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I think that's a really, really important thing to bring up about the education system today. Now, as I understand it, you could possibly start a non-accredited school teaching just about anything you want in this way, right?
Absolutely. And I actually have tried to start my own school twice at least. And one time I came really, really close to pulling it off. And you can't, I couldn't call it a school per se, depending, each state has its own laws, right? But in Washington, at least, if I was going to have the word school in the title, I would have to have like certain width doorways and like certain colors in these areas of the wall, or just so many things that I didn't want to deal with. So I was going to call it, wow, I don't even remember. Oh, it was hack schooling. That still had school in it though. Maybe because it was all one word, it was different. Somehow I was going to legally pull that off. I don't remember exactly how, but I had these families who were interested, and it was basically like a homeschooling, community-based organization where we were going to be in the same building with all of these other local businesses. And there was a community garden there. There was like a seamstress there. There was a retail store there. There was a lawyer there. There was some kind of community outreach group there. There was just all these different things going on. And part of the curriculum was going to be a requirement that you work with each one or more of these organizations every week for a certain number of hours, or another one if they wanted, but just to have this sort of internship and community service aspect meshed in with the curriculum. And the rest of it was going to be project-based and proposed by each student, as well as sort of group lessons on basic fundamentals that could be applied to anyone at any level, especially with like logic and, writing and grammar and these sorts of things that are sort of more universal. And we were going to have all of that. And it sounded beautiful to me. I was like, this is so exciting. This is kind of exactly like what I'm really into. And we had something like 14 students. And basically one of the families moved away suddenly, and like 6 of the students was theirs. And then their friends who were going to do it with them decided they didn't want to do it without them. So they backed out. And then the only family left, I had like 9 students or so, a lot of students. They wanted to then own anything we did as their own curriculum they could then sell. And I was like, that feels really weird to me. I'm not really into it. And they were kind of like, well, our way or the highway. And I was like, okay, I'll choose the highway.
Yeah, exactly.
So it fell apart. And then I tried to do it again here where I'm at in Colorado, when all of this pandemic stuff started to hit and all these restrictions, and school was getting weird for people, and a lot of people were starting to back out of that system. And so I was trying to offer like a another sort of homeschooling option where, we could still meet multiple times a week for a number of hours and kind of work on projects together, and I could kind of give direction, but at multi-age and all kind of individualized, but in a group, if that makes sense. And basically nobody is willing to pay what it would cost for my time to commit to that. And it was still really cheap as far as I was concerned, because it was going to be all kind of unofficial at first until maybe it grew later, right? And it was something like $200 a month per kid, which is like so cheap.
That's not bad.
Yeah. And I had to just have a minimum number of kids. I think I was going to do like 20, right? Or something like that. And maybe it was $300 a month, still super cheap. And people were like, oh, that's way too expensive. I can go to this private school down the road for whatever if I have like a voucher. And I'm like, I don't, okay. Wow. I mean, what do you want me to be in poverty for you or what?
Yeah, exactly.
So,
it's
amazing I find that a lot.
How little people actually value education and their children, and they think about it as like, oh, it's a free thing that I send my kids to for public school. And it's like, yeah, but half of them end up being boneheads. Like they don't know crap about anything. I mean, literally they learn more from the TV than they do from school, because, and I can prove this, because if you ask them about their favorite rapper, their favorite show, their favorite characters on certain things that they're watching, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, they can go off on that. They can tell you everything about the actor's life and the characters and the plots. They can't tell you anything about the quadratic formula. They can't tell you anything about, what's the function of a preposition. They can't, any of these things. So yeah, I think that it's absolutely fantastic that non-accredited schools exist. Of course, the uphill battle there being that once the kids graduate, they have to essentially take state confirmed testing to show that they're at a certain point in order to be able to be given their diplomas and other things like that. So,
well, in some states, actually, if you're an accredited teacher like me, you can award diplomas. The problem comes with colleges accepting them or not. But there's a whole host of colleges, some of them really, really great colleges and universities, that start to accept these because they've started to realize, oh, wow, the quality of student we get from these sort of unschooling, hack-schooling, homeschooled sort of individuals is way higher than what we're getting from high schools, even the high schools that they themselves have rated sort of higher than like, other high schools, public or private. And so they've started accepting that. And again, you still have to pass a test. But as far as I know, most colleges have entrance tests anyway, more for kind of like placement and to make sure that you kind of meet the basics than anything. So that's not a bad deal, right? You get to maybe homeschool, hack school, unschool your whole education, and then, pass a few tests and get into whatever university you might want. So you kind of have to know ahead of time, which university might I go to, make sure that they actually have a pathway like that open before you might want to commit to something like that. But the path exists.
That's really cool, actually, to hear. I wasn't aware of that. It's been several years. I'm no longer an active member, but I used to be a very active member and go to the conventions of the Alternative Education Resource Organization, or AERO.
Oh, cool.
And so there, we would constantly be shown lots of different types of teaching methods, like free school and Waldorf education, all these other places. They would come there, and especially at the conventions, we'd be able to have speakers who would talk about what has really worked. And it's case study stuff where they're like, hey, we came up with this new idea for how to teach our children this type of thing. We enacted this criteria and curriculum, and here was the result of it. And being able to see all of the different, because we had people from Puerto Rico and Costa Rica, we had people from, Canada, of course, and Mexico and the United States, and a few people from Europe who were guest speakers and authors and things like that. It was just really cool to be able to see all of the different minds coming together, and to contrast it to how linear and boring most of my educational experience was as a kid. And even at that, I had some really damn good teachers, and I went to private school for a good portion of my life. So we had much smaller class sizes and the ability to focus in on education. The thing that they always taught us, it was a mantra there, was your parents are paying us to teach you to learn how to learn.
Yes.
If you can learn how to learn, then there's nothing that you can't teach yourself. And it was a very empowering thing. And I don't think most of my peers walked away with that, but I know that I did. That was important.
That's one of the funny things that happened my last year of teaching, that just kind of was one of the many things that came together to show me like, okay, I'm done here. And it was that I was at this conference, and you have to go to a certain number a year, and they're mostly useless, but you have to like tick off the box that you did your continuing education. And it'd be neat if we got to go to things like what you just described, and that would count. I would love that. But most of them are kind of pointless and empty and shallow. But anyways, I was at one of them, and we're in a whole group session, and there's maybe 100 or something more teachers there. And they asked the question, if you have one thing that you would guarantee that your students would leave high school with, what would that skill be, or what would that set of knowledge be? And all these teachers had to go around and say, and when it got to me, I said, the ability to think logically. And I meant classic logic, logic. And the whole room laughed like I had just made a joke. Wow. And I was very confused. I was like, do they think I'm being funny because they think these students aren't capable of achieving that? And I quickly thought, no, that can't be it. That's not it. They're laughing because they think that's already a given. Yeah. And it is not. I know very, very few students who leave with the ability to think critically or analytically or logically. And I'm not exaggerating. And that's why I said it, is that had been my driving like motivation, no matter what class I was teaching over the past handful of years, was to sneak in logic and analysis skills into the curriculum for them, so that they would at least have one exposure to it. And these teachers thought, oh, of course they're going to think logically, and like I don't even think you know what that means. And that's part of why you're laughing.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. When I take a look at logic, it is primarily now for me, there's always been this thing long before I was even into alchemy, but is that if I take a word that is used, say colloquially, like logic, meaning, are you thinking logically? Right. And then that same term is used in a particular trade or sector, like in mathematics, for instance, it leads me to believe that the ways that we think about things need to be combined on both of those levels, and they see eye to eye if you actually follow that train of thought far enough. So for me, logic is a very mathematically oriented thing. If this, then this, or something that, like with geometry, there's theorems and proofs, and it's like, because this is true, then this thing can also then be true, and this thing can also then be true. And if there's a break in that sequence anywhere, then hell, it's probably not true, or we can't prove it. And I think that looking at things that way, from that mathematical perspective, and drawing that into just your everyday reality, was one of the most important and pivotal points in my life. And that came to me from a teacher who's unfortunately now deceased. He went on to become a professor after teaching our high school, but his name was Mr. Iacovelli. He taught us geometry, and he taught us how to apply it to the real world, real life.
And this is one of the things that gets me too, is math. Math has been degraded to this just series of formulas to memorize, which isn't bad necessarily in itself, but when it's only that, and now there's no
context.
Yeah. And kids can't understand that, like, I don't even know if I'm supposed to call it maybe like the philosophy of math or the logic of math that can apply to the whole rest of your life and everything you ever do. That's the beautiful, really important part. I think that if you can get to that and do like geometry right and learn it correctly, then you start to understand, like, oh my God, the whole world is like unlocked by this way of thinking. And that is unfathomably important. And we just have reduced it to like Common Core, and just really, I don't know, if you go into a high school math class anytime, I think you'll be stunned by how really, really degraded it is.
I know, it's sad. It is really sad. Well, we're at the point where we should probably take the first break. When we come back, I want to unpack more about how you decided to get into RogueWays and a few other things like that. So thanks for listening, everybody. We'll be right back.
Have you heard about our Spagyrics of the Month Club yet? As you probably know, we release 5 new Spagyrics each month. These range in the style of Spagyric pharmacopoeia from tinctures, elixirs, essences, clyci, stones, and much more. But now, you can get your hands on all 5 new releases each month at just a fraction of the normal cost by being part of our Spagyrics of the Month Club. It's the very best way to inexpensively build your home Spagyric apothecary, and it's also the best way to support our research academy. Participating is easy. Sign up for the $75 a month subscription on our website, and we ship you a 4 ml size of all 5 newly released Spagyrics that month. And shipping's even included for all orders within the USA. The best part is, you just sign up once and sit back and receive your new Spagyrics delivered right to your door. It really doesn't get any easier. To get started or to learn more, go to phoenixaurelius.org and scroll down to the Spagyrics of the Month Club area on our homepage. As always, thanks so much for supporting our work.
All right, thanks for joining us, everybody. This is part 2 of this Alchemi-Culture episode with Miss Lindsey Scharmyn. We were just, during the first part, before the break, we were talking more about her works as an author, her work as a teacher, kind of philosophizing a little bit about modern day education, rapping on about that. But, you know, most of you know that she's got a really awesome show called RogueWays, and you've also got a premium content show called Middle Path now too, right?
Yes, and it's actually it's mostly not premium content. It's just exclusively on Rockfin, and so it's actually free for anyone who goes to Rockfin and just creates an account really simply. But I do want to do more and more premium content there. I just for a while am letting it be kind of open, and just removing one episode of RogueWays a week and making it Rockfin exclusive and a new show called Middle Path was kind of enough, I think, for people to start to transition to, that I'm kind of slow rolling the more premium access. But I do sometimes have pieces of interviews or like my tarot readings for each month. I do premium content, and that's available for people who are supporters on Rockfin. So there'll be more and more of that as time goes on.
Wow, that's really cool. So we should really get into what inspired you to do RogueWays, and where did that the gumption to actually create it come from? What were you doing in life at the time, and how did the idea come to fruition?
Well, I was at a point in my educational career where I was very solid and things just kind of moved, smoothly, which is not always the case for many years, especially when you're starting. It's a lot to get used to and adapt to and work on. And so I kind of found this groove, and I had a little bit more free time because of that. I went from 80-hour work weeks basically to like 50 maybe. So that felt like a break. And so that combined with this realization that there were groups online that understood, conspiracy from a less insane point of view, like a more rational and objective and sort of logical view of conspiracy, and wanted to talk about it and wanted to dig through things and didn't just dismiss things because they were too crazy, and actually tried to look, no matter how crazy it sounded, at like what the evidence might be and the different aspects of it. And I fell in love with this because I didn't have a lot of people in my life who liked to. I love thinking about mysteries and just anything weird. I don't want to just discount it. I want to think about it. So yeah, this like blew my mind. I was like, wow, there's all these people out here. So I was in this online, in Facebook group who was talking to all these people, and I was like so exuberant about it and like enjoyed it so much that people just kind of like gravitated towards me as like a leader sort of in this group. And I wasn't trying to do that. It just happened. And so it just kind of accumulated over time. And then, they were all like, hey, let's all do like a show, we'll get together on, I don't think we had Zoom at the time. I think it was Hangouts. I don't know.
Yeah. Google Hangouts, man.
Yeah. And we'll talk about these episodes of these shows that we love. And we'll like rip apart all these conspiracies. And I was like, cool, that sounds like fun. And they're like, yeah, you lead it. I was like, that's a lot. And I was kind of weighed it, because it would be really fun for me. I'm a teacher, so I'm naturally like good at kind of arranging, this experience and giving everyone fair time to talk and share. And I'm very used to that. Those are skills I have. So it kind of made sense. And I was like, you know what, why not? We'll try it. And it's not like I have to commit to doing this forever. We'll just see if it's fun. We'll keep doing it. If it's not fun, we'll stop. So I started doing it, and it was very, very fun. And I loved it. And people loved it. And soon, as I kind of intimated earlier, it got to the point where I was like, well, I'm putting all of this time and effort into creating this show that's not really my own show, because really all we do is talk about these other shows that someone else made. But I have all of this, ground to stand on and this foundation to stand on. I've been interested in these things my whole life, and I have many of my own experiences. And again, my skills as a teacher were like perfectly suited to this in ways that I never would have expected. And so it all just kind of combined, and I thought, yeah, I'll just make my own show. And then there was a bit of sort of like divine inspiration in that, because it was like, once I sat down to think about what would my own show be like or be about, or how would I do it, it was just like the list of sort of descriptors came out, the list of sort of topics came out, the name just popped out, a logo popped out, like it all just kind of like flowed together. And I like spit out this sort of template of how I would want each episode to be sort of organized. And my catchphrases just kind of like flew out, and I didn't really even think or plan much of it. And I have since realized a lot of what I write and do kind of comes like that, where it just sort of hits me and flows out without my rational mind getting in the way. If I can get my rational mind out of the way, rather, it just sort of comes together like that. And I look back, and that was, I think, 3 or 3.5 years ago.
Wow.
Maybe 4. I think 3 years ago. But anyways, I look back at that and I'm still have the exact same catchphrase at the beginning, ending phrase at the end, structure of the show. And I'm like, how really? I mean, how did I like do that so perfectly 3 years ago that I still stuck with it to this day? So there was a part of it that definitely was just the right time, and it was how it was supposed to be.
Yeah, seriously. So what were some of the challenges in setting up RogueWays? Because, obviously, starting any podcast now, I know this one experientially as well, is that even getting listeners, trying to find people who are interested in your content is really kind of a big deal. And then there's the monetization component of it too. It's like, I'm putting a lot of time booking people and, trying to keep things straight, coming up with good questions, writing intros, whatever it is. It takes a lot of time just off the scene. And then you've got on the scene production time as well. So how did that come about for you? Was that something hard or did it just kind of fall into place?
It was hard, but again, I think this is another thing teaching prepared me for, because like I said, it was many years where I was working literally like 80-hour weeks, and to try and streamline that down to the point where I could get away with only 50 hours a week or so and still be doing what I consider to be a good job was very, very intensive and super hyper organized and very quick. I mean, the teachers I worked with would be like, why are you never just like talking with us or like hanging out? And I'm like, because I don't have time, because I want to get this done. And so I learned a lot of ways of getting things done, like during kind of downtime from other things. So I'd be literally driving to work and I'd be speaking into my phone to write out my script for the show that night or something, for example. And part of it was, a lot of trial and error, where I was like, well, I'm going to try it this way. Okay, well, that went horribly bad. And now I'm going to do it a different way. And I've always leaned towards live shows because it's a lot less editing and post-production. I just let it go out. And I think that's another thing teaching prepared me for, is I've been talking in front of people live for years. And so I kind of understand and don't have as much, I guess, like need to, I just think a lot of people are, scared of like, oh, I'm going to mess it up and then I'm going to need to cut that part out. And I'm like, well,
I don't care. I'm good off the cuff.
Right. I'm going to mess it up sometimes and no one's really going to care that much. It's going to be okay. And I think there are people who probably wish my quality was a bit higher in that regard, but it works out pretty well. It's the style of the show. And so those are parts of it, but the audience part and the monetization part was super, super slow. And honestly, I needed a lot of help from a lot of kind of bigger names and bigger shows to help me get any kind of exposure. But even that is hard because I know I have so much evidence of manipulation from, the platforms like YouTube and I think honestly, even bigger than that, maybe some super secret government algorithm site type things, not just like Facebook and YouTube that are suppressing things. So I know that the stuff like that has been going on too. And it's very frustrating because I think if you or I, even a handful of years ago, had started these things, the organic growth would be so much more than what
Yeah.
we're going to get to experience now, unfortunately. So that's a huge challenge and a huge frustration. But for a very long time, I just had to kind of do it and know I might not get a lot of traction and I might not get any money ever. But my intention is that I'm going to keep doing it because I love it, because it's fun, because I no longer teach students who are in the public education realm, and I want to keep teaching. So now I'm teaching, people who want to come listen and be a part of my show. And so for all those reasons, my heart is going to stay in it, but I'm going to probably move pretty slowly. And it did take a lot of time, and I even had that original group of people who had kind of, found me in that forum and joined with me in that previous version of covering other people's shows. And they kind of came over with me. So I had like a base, which was really nice to start with too.
Yeah.
That was really lucky and fortunate. It wasn't like the plan. It's just how it happened. But yeah, a lot of bigger names have gotten me some good exposure that I think has been crucial to my growth. And then now, it's still not a lot of money that comes in each month. It's pretty, like, it's nowhere near what somebody would need in order to be able to survive.
Yeah.
But Rockfin has helped a lot because Rockfin has such a cool method, but it's all cryptocurrency too. So you have to kind of like be
well,
cool
and there's
with
ups
that.
and downs to that. Like sometimes the trade-in value can be really high, other times not, but then you still have to understand how to be able to trade out your cryptocurrency and how to be able to read the market, stuff like that.
Yeah, that's its own ball game. So I just sit on it and pretend it's like monopoly money, and maybe someday I'll get something with it, and who knows.
Yeah.
But I'm very lucky because I also have my other services and products and things that I do. And so the show kind of gives me an avenue to be able to give exposure to that, so that people who are looking for any of those can at least have a chance of finding me in the world. So that helps too. They sort of work in tandem. And with that going on, then I, can tend to get kind of enough for me.
Well, let's go into censorship actually, because a lot of the content that you tend to cover historically is very, shall we say, risque sociologically, meaning that it doesn't necessarily fit within the mainstream narrative. And again, this goes back to the same way that you might try and foster critical thinking skills in your students. Like you said, so much of your work is transposed with the work that you're doing right now. I think that that's one of the big things, is trying to open people's minds and hear cases very objectively about what is going on or what could be going on. That's one of the things that I know I like most about your work, is that thing. So how do you navigate all of that? How do you decide who you're going to talk to and what you're going to talk about? Do you just give zero fucks, or what is it about your work that allows RogueWays to continue the way that it has?
I basically give zero fucks. This is another thing I have a history of, ever since I was very young. I'm like, I'm going to do whatever I want. You can come with me or not. Like, I don't care. And, even when I was teaching, like I said, that first book I did and those blogs that I had, like those, I had to very much hide them from my public life and publish under a pen name. And at the same time, within the blog itself, within the book itself, I'm going to say whatever I actually think and whatever I want. A lot of people have a problem with it. A lot of people came to me with the book and they were like, if you didn't swear in your book, there would be a lot more people who would enjoy it. And I said, yeah, but if I didn't swear in my book, I wouldn't be being honest to my own voice and intention. And so I don't really care if people like it, right? I care that it's something I loved and created because I thought it needed to exist, not because I wanted to please you. And I like feedback, but that type of idea that I should be doing something a certain way because other people will enjoy it more is like it's not what I'm
like, no, that's not the way I play.
Yeah, that's not what I'm doing this for. And so I feel the same way about the show, where I have this intention that I'm going to, like you said, try and look at anything, literally anything, very objectively. And then also share my opinion about it, my ideas about it, like things it makes me think of, and not give too much weight to any of those things, but have fun sort of philosophizing and, going that route with it. And I get the same thing where there's a lot of people on the sort of heavy conspiracy side of things that give me criticism because I don't just buy into stuff and I don't just like go along with it. I don't like make proclamations like, okay, that's the verdict's in and the earth is flat. I just say, well, as of right now, it seems to me like this might be true, and who really knows? And I get some criticism for that, and then I also get a criticism from the other side, that's saying like, I don't know, just people want it,
Yeah, like
both
you're
ways.
too out there, like you're, like this kind of stuff doesn't even need to be inquired into. And, I being more or less in the same genre and the same stance as you, like I try to actually take a more middle path to just about everything. Not because I'm indecisive or I don't want to commit to one side or the other, but it's that in my time, during my life, I have committed so hard to certain things only to find out that there were falsities within it that I wasn't even aware of because I hadn't inquired deep enough. I didn't even have the awareness of what I needed to inquire into deep enough. And only time began to show me these certain things that said, well, this played out this way and this played out this way. So from the modern conspiracy angle, so many people might get the sniff of bullshit going on somewhere and then blow it up that the whole thing is bullshit, which can be good to be able to smell it out. It hones your senses. But when you take your senses and you frame the entire picture around what something is or is not, then I think that that's where a lot of people lose me in particular. And that's also where a lot of listeners, I was on Crow 777 couple of times, and we got a lot of listeners from there being like, oh, he's too mainstream, he's like, that was like this terrible
That's a
thing
criticism.
yeah, exactly, too mainstream. And then from the other side, I'd get people, it's like, oh, Phoenix, I absolutely love your work, will you just stick with lab work because these other things that you're talking about are just ridiculous? And it's like, well, no, they actually go hand in hand. You can't really separate them, at least with the persona that I am. You can't really separate these things because they weave and bleed, they're just so indelibly intertwined that they bleed into each other in a way that you can't distinguish one from the other. So yeah, I think it's interesting today how divided everybody is into camps. And it's like at this particular moment in time, actually it was worse around December of 2020. That was like the most divided I think I have ever seen the entire world. It's eased up a little bit now, not terribly, but still it's eased up a lot more now. But it's just crazy. You have the vaccine versus anti-vaccine, you have the Trumps versus the Democrats, and really it wasn't even about Biden per se. It was like Trump versus the world in a certain regard. And yeah, it was just so crazy to see everywhere globally, people were so divided based on things that they really didn't know that much about in the first place and that really don't affect them that much. So yeah, I guess I'm bringing all this up because I want to see how your perspective of the world has changed, interviewing so many people and trying to get so many different takes. And how's that influence your worldview right now?
Well, it's really, it's like a crucial part of my makeup that I like need all the different things. Like I need change and I need variety and I need to like mash it all together. And, and it helps me because I tend to look at the world in these kind of overarching like principles and connections more than like the details themselves. So the more people I talk to and the more information I get, the more I can start to see these kind of broad generalities. And at the same time, not make the mistake of thinking, therefore, this is the generality all the time. There's always these exceptions too. And like, I love that. I love those patterns. I love that type of puzzle. And I love trying to like navigate through that. And it's awesome for me. It's awesome fun. So that's another thing I get, I think, criticized about is people are like, well, you're kind of all over the place. Like you're going to interview this person who's on like this side of things and you're going to interview that person who's on that side of things. And I'm like, yeah, but who cares? Because people make this mistake of thinking that because you're talking with someone, you automatically agree with everything they say, everything they've ever said, and everything they've ever done. And I'm like, why would you ever think that? How did that even become part of your projection? Like I've never found anyone who agrees 100% with anyone else, let alone just because they're in the same room with them or whatever, and that's my whole thing is I want to talk to anybody about anything. And it's sad to me when we can't talk to anybody about anything, and
Yeah.
you don't have to adopt their take. You don't have to adopt their role, their way of doing things to just talk to them and just see, why do you think that? And where did you get it? And where are you headed with it? And like, you're only going to gain from that. And so I just feel like I get more and more nuanced of an understanding of the world in every single sort of topic that you could possibly have just by talking to people. And this is part of why doing RogueWays and Middle Path is always so much fun for me, is I just get to explore. And that's my favorite thing to do.
Yeah.
So I'm very unattached to most everything about, the way I view the world. And when I find something I'm really attached to, that's even more fun, because I'm like, oh, here's a thing I've never questioned before. And flat Earth was one of those things for me where I was like, wait, what? Why would you ever think that? That's crazy. And then I heard myself thinking that. I was like, okay, red flag, like stop, slow down.
Exactly.
Go investigate, because if you've never thought about it, you've never questioned it, that's exactly what you should go question. So it has, especially this process of doing RogueWays, opened me up even more to questioning even more deeply held like axioms, like we're talking about math and geometry. And that was my favorite things to learn, was that there are axioms. And I was like, well, hold on. This is like the whole system could fall down then, because those are literally, you're saying, untested, unverifiable assumptions. Like, whoa, and my teacher explained to me, well, yeah, but we have to have them in order to do this work. And so I sort of learned the value of, of being able to work with this set of assumptions, but while knowing that they're assumptions and that they might not be true.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and trying to see, is there any evidence or any logic that could show that they are not true, or that there is a better axiom to base the proof on? And yeah, I think that again, drawing back to geometry, for me, that's huge. Okay, so when I started learning alchemy, the concept was that there are 4 elements and then a 5th element, the quintessence, so to speak, where it's all of the 4 elements combined, but none of them in such a way that one predominates over the other. And at the same time, I was learning Pythagoreanism, which dealt so heavily with the Platonic solids, which, Plato wasn't even around when Pythagoras was originally teaching about this. And so they should really be called Pythagorean solids. But you have the sphere and, the cube and the octahedron, and then you have the dodecahedron and the icosahedron, and learning all of their elemental kind of signatures, and then being able to see, even on a subcellular level, how these different geometries really are kind of at the base of everything that we know. Everything, especially when you think about them as an archetypal coding program. It's like all of those were made up of zeros and ones, which is to say a 0 would be an angle and a 1 would be a segment or a line. And that different combinations of those zeros and ones create these perfected structures, which are basically like short code programming. And those different structures of the elements end up kind of arranging themselves in different styles, in different ways, in different fractions, in order to be able to create more macro coding, or what we might refer to as, like JavaScript or C++ or other things like that. And when I started relaying it back to what I knew about computer programming and coding, it was like, wow, the energetic nature of the universe works basically in the exact same way as mathematics does.
Wow.
And that was a huge realization for me. So I'm still drawing everything back and trying to give people, kind of that broader perspective that I see from, because it's so useful in the day-to-day. And it is something that I think that for the most part, you don't need to have an axiom about. You can actually see that any series of numbers can actually be expressed as zeros or ones or sequences thereof. Like for instance, -3 would be 0, 1, 1, 1, because you start at 0 and you're taking away from 0 as a result of that. Or 1, 1, 1, 0 would be the same exact way of calculating that, depending on the numerical value and the series of computation, the order of computation. So it's just fascinating. And what's cool is Roman numerals actually work like that.
Well, they do, yeah. Like the one before the V is 4 and the one after the V is 6.
Exactly.
Huh.
So
Well, you just helped me like crystallize something that I was just talking about on an episode last night on Middle Path. I was talking about the number 5 because all these 5 synchronicities and 5 information packets were just like dumping on me for the past week. I was like, cool, I'll do a show on 5, whatever. Like, leave me alone. Well, don't leave me alone, but you know, slow it down. So I started putting all that together, and I got to this. One of the things that had come to me was that 5 elements. And, you know, because we're taught 4 elements, and we're taught 4 states of matter, but there's actually 5 states of matter.
Yeah.
You know, and we're taught all of these 4 things, but there's actually 5 of it. And when you said quintessence, I just like, it struck me right now that quint is 5 and essence, the essence of all 5 is in that one. But like you said, no one outweighs the other. And like, wouldn't that be the ultimate substance or the ultimate state of matter, right? From which everything else is kind of trickles down from or derives from. And that blows my mind. So I'd like to ask you, actually, we have solid, gas, liquid, and then beyond that, most people aren't really told about it, but we have plasma and then ether. Yeah. And ether is the quintessence.
Yeah. Traditionally speaking, they would even spell it AETHER, aether. And that would be the whole concept of like the energetic blueprint before things even manifest into plasma. And then from there, there's varying states. So like a vapor is probably the most volatile of the 3 states of matter that we typically learn about. And then you have liquid, which is an intermediary between vapor and solid, and then solid. So to us as alchemists, the solid would obviously be the earth, water would be the liquid phase, air would be that vaporous phase, plasma would be fire, and ether would be that etheric kind of force, or what some would refer to as the quintessence.
That's so cool. And then why then? So when I'm looking at materialist modern, physics or whatever, they're talking about the 5th state being the Bose-Einstein condensate. I'm probably saying that wrong, but what is that? Is that connected at all? Or are they just like off on their own stupid thing?
Yeah. So I'm not involved scholastically inside of physics. So my understanding and interpretation of it might actually be different than somebody who is, scholastically or academically involved in this realm. But as I understand it, that condensate is basically talking about the switchover point between quantum data to what we can measure by way of gravitational force, electromagnetic force, strong nuclear and weak nuclear force, which again, those are like holographic aspects. Those 4 states are holographic aspects of the elements as well. So we like to think that gravitational corresponds to the earth, that water is electromagnetic because there's a flow of electrons. It abides by essentially the same archetypal concept as what water abides by. And then you have the weak nuclear force being air or wind, and the strong nuclear force being fire. And beyond that, we would refer to that as the quantum. The quantum is the combination actually of all of those and where they derive their individuality from, where they're able to separate out, and that would be the quantum or quanta. And that's basically the exact same theory that guides my energy medicine work too, really, is looking at informational fields as what exists above even the spiritual plane itself corresponding to fire, the causal plane of yes and no's and that kind of binary zone being composed of air or correlating to air. The astral plane, again, astral and the movements of things, they deal with ebb and flow. And so this is all water. And then the physical plane, which is earth. And so everything for me can be broken down into this quintessential system that basically no matter where you look, it's always holographically and fractally present in every different area. And so, yeah.
Man, why? And 5 is just the number. It's just the number that it is, right?
It's the number that it is. Well, and then 3 shows up, and 3 and 5 are twin primes, of course.
Oh, yeah.
So a twin prime basically means that they're just one number off, and they become increasingly more rare the higher in numerical value of what are considered, it's even beyond real numbers, they're called natural numbers that exist. So yeah, 3.
Which are the phi ratio is a natural number, right?
Yeah. Oh,
Those
no, that's a
natural
real
numbers?
number. That would
Oh,
be
okay.
considered a real number. A natural number would be anything above zero that you can count, like 0, 1, 2, 3,
Okay.
all the way up to infinity. All of those could be considered um, like natural numbers, but real numbers could be anything that can be expressed as a decimal, a fraction,
Okay.
even by like things like phi and phi and pi. Every single one of those would be real numbers. And so it's a whole classification system within modern mathematics that kind of talks about that. But yeah, it's really, really fascinating actually to me to look at, numerology in terms of its short code, um, meaning that zeros and ones are the basis behind everything, but then each number is a short code sequence. So one would just be one, two, 1, 1, 3, 1, 1, 1, that kind of concept.
Yeah.
And seeing different combinations begin to develop, because when we take a look at the number one, there's the primacy of the absolute, or the source of all of creation, the creative force, so to speak, of the universe or the cosmos, however you want to refer to that, the individuated spark within, like the moment where you have sperm cell meeting with an ovum and being fertilized, turning zygote, and all these other like that huge electromagnetic flash. That is like a microcosmic beginning to your life, in the same way that I have to conceive of the same kind of thing happen to what we know as the physical universe at some point.
Mhm.
And so again, it's this archetypal, holographic, and fractal kind of concept that can be seen over and over and over and over again. And then two, your zeros and ones, or masculine, feminine, turning off a function, turning on a function, all of those basic kinds of things. And then from that are three, but really you don't notice that three exist until you double two. So if one doubles and it creates two, two doubles and it creates four. Now there's three different groupings of those four, if you line them out like this, that can be made, and that's where three makes itself noticeable, but it's not relevant unless four already existed. Because from two things, you can't create three things directly, but you can create four things by doubling itself. So there's a masculine pole and a feminine pole, but the masculine pole has a masculine pole and a feminine pole, and the feminine pole has a feminine pole and a masculine pole. And so being able to see how two ends up creating four, but then there is, again, if we're talking about the four elements, there's a combination of water and earth, and that creates salt, or alchemical salt, which we would call like physicality. Then there's a combination of water and air together, and that creates what we call mercury, or vapor. And like if you've ever looked out at the ocean and seen that tiny little space right above the water line where there's like this blue coronal discharge, and it's kind of always see-through and wavy and things like that.
Yeah.
It's like that's a moment where water meets air, and it's always very vaporous right there. And then you have your third grouping finally of your air and your fire, and that creates the archetype of sulfur, the soul. And breaking almost anything down, you can break it down into these three groupings of soul, spirit, and body, or sulfur, mercury, and salt, as we use in the alchemical thing. And then again, you go to five. Five doesn't exist without four, once again. So the context for it is two into itself twice. And we just keep seeing all of these patterns numerically playing out. It's just always fascinated me.
It's really fascinating. And it's like the people always said, oh, you're usually either like, English and social studies or math and science, and not both. And I was always like, no, math is fascinating. I'm not exceptionally good at it. I don't have the mind to like memorize all of these things necessarily.
Yeah.
But getting down to the like what you just described, and the like conceptual, philosophical sort of side of it has always been like so awesome to me. I've written math poems like a dork. And and like, because I'll be studying math and I'll have this realization. I'm like, oh my God, I need to like put this into a poem because it's so beautiful. Like, this is amazing. One of the titles of my books is about sine waves, because when I was studying That blew my mind. And I love math. And it's, again, I get that I am not really a mathematical mind, but I just think there's value in anybody pursuing it and trying to understand. The more you try to understand any of these things, like we were talking about earlier, the more it kind of relates to all these other things that you've already understood, and you're only enhancing your view of the world. So I think math is so beautiful.
I know, me too. It was fantastic. Although, like yourself, I would not classify myself as a mathematician. In fact, through most of school, I didn't get beyond pre-calculus in high school, actually, just because it didn't make sense to me. What was I calculating these things for? There's virtually no practical application. It wasn't until I started taking physics that I was like, oh, that's why they wanted to teach us this math. Like now, with like calculus, I can calculate very complex trajectories over crazy surfaces that may or may not necessarily be flat or solid, and I can understand how they're going to move and what the all of these basic things about my calculations. Now they make sense. Now they give me some sort of practical application. I could see why, in order to test things out and then to prove what it is that you're seeing, how that was awesome. Because language, now I'm technically a linguist. That's what I was trained for and what I went to college for. And when we talk about language, there are so many different ways of expressing the same idea or the same concept. So much of language has so much room for interpretation that we don't even know if we're actually talking about the same thing, or if what we're saying is being interpreted with the intention by which we meant it. That is something that cannot necessarily be true within mathematics. It requires such a level of precision that you can actually show, if this, then this, it's a very logical movement, or this equals this, or this is about this, all of these different types of things that specifically draw value. They have value to each one of those subcomponents of the equation. And yeah, it's just fascinating that language does not have that same level of precision. But in that way, it's very beautiful in its own right, because now it allows for poetry and all of the permutations that happen from misunderstanding.
True.
Because new thoughts, new ideas are going to come out of something that was never intended to be expressed. And so I think that's really beautiful.
I love those experiences where someone's saying something and I like have this realization. I'm like, wow. And I'm like, go off on this route. They're like, that's not even what I was talking about. I'm like, oh,
you're like,
well, my brain
that's what I was talking about.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. That's a beautiful thing too. I know as an author and a writer, I always talk about how absolutely atrocious words are. The language is very weak, actually, but that's part of the beauty of being a writer, is trying to find like the right combination of things and the right pattern and cadence and tone and whatever to get somebody to get it, it's very difficult, actually. And so I love it for that reason. But words are real bad. I don't know if it's the words or if it's just like we were talking about earlier, when I said to a room full of teachers, well, I'd like my students to be able to think and use logic, and they laughed because, like you said, they're interpreting it this other way. That is not what I meant.
Yeah, you're like, no, literally, most
Logic.
of these kids don't know their head from their ass, or their ass from a hole in the ground. And so teaching them to think logically will help them determine if that's true.
Yeah, or even just think at all, because a lot of education, as we know, is just, here, I'm going to tell you this fact. Now you write this down on a paper, and then you regurgitate it again in a week on the quiz.
Oh, God, how many of the things that we learned as facts have just come up within our lifetimes, being like, oh, actually, these other things that we didn't even know have, popped up. And that's just happened more times than I can even keep track of in all different sectors of reality. So
but don't worry, because the science is settled.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's, what did they say? Reality is a lie agreed upon.
Yeah.
And I think that's really fantastic. During the break, I was actually talking to you about the YouTube video called "Math Has a Fatal Flaw," and this just came out last month. But that video really unpacked some really cool logical ideas, tying all of what we've just been talking about into a very cohesive, cool thing. For those of you who aren't even interested in math, I still suggest watching it. Some of the concepts might go slightly above your head, but the guy who's presenting it is talking about it and teaching it from like, no, you don't know anything about these things, and talking about it and then drawing back to the philosophy of what that means and how we can even prove that. And at the end of the video, he goes back to basically telling us like, yeah, we may not be able to actually prove our reality, but it's the search that we're in of trying to do that, where all sorts of new revelations come to us and where we're able to latch on to new ideas. And I think that that's really the beauty of using either language or mathematics or anything to express our perception of reality, is that it expands our perception.
Yeah. And it's like that, we were talking about like sort of having these sets of axioms that are everything is based upon in math and geometry. And, like my kind of thing where I was like, well, then all of this is bullshit, right? But then understanding, well, it might be in the end, probably not, but it might be. But also, if you want to do X, Y, and Z, you have to start on some sort of like series of suppositions. So it's like a question of what do you want to do? What are you here for? What are you trying to accomplish? Well, then you need to work with it like this, right? And I always go back to this when people get kind of lost or really attached to this whole like, okay, everything's a simulation, that we live in a simulation, and they're like, it has to be a simulation, it's like this and this and this, and I'm like, well, maybe it is, right? And then so what? Like, what is that gonna change about your life? Right?
Exactly.
Like, what are you gonna do with it? And if you're gonna do something with it, cool, move forward with the presumption that this is a simulation. But if it's just gonna drive you insane and make you feel like you're trapped in a box somewhere and you can't get out of it, maybe let go of that supposition and move on to something else.
Yeah.
You just like it's important to know the axioms and the suppositions you've made, but it's also important to choose the ones that are working well for you.
Yeah. Well, and in so much of that, I think that that's where themes of life and both personal and cultural evolution basically come down to. In fact, along those same lines, it'll take me a second to be able to draw this line through conversation with you, but I think that we can make it, and it's worth making. Have you ever seen the YouTube blogger that goes by Fearless and Far?
Mm-mm.
Okay, so his whole spiel is that he tries to do things that push him to his limits that he'd otherwise be afraid to do, and to be able to move past that, to confront his fears, and to travel around the world doing it, exposing himself to ideas, people, cultures, foods, etc., that are really going to break his comfort zone and push him to grow as an individual. And so it's pretty cool. A lot of people do this in different ways anyway, but it's really cool to see how he does it sometimes, because he went to this African tribe in Tanzania who are one of the last hunter-gatherers on the planet. And I can see how it's written in my head, but I can't remember how to pronounce it. So I'm just going to let you know that they're in Tanzania. And he asked them philosophical questions. Now, this was going through a translator, but the translator, whose name was Yusuf, spoke really good English. And he also spoke this Tanzanian dialect of these hunter-gatherers, of which there are only 1,200 or so left in the world. And only about 400 of them actually live according to their hunter and gatherer ways. But he got in with these ones that still do. And he asked them, well, what's the purpose of life? And they said, meat. Well, meat, honey. That was their answer. That was the purpose of life. And I think that it's just really fascinating, because with exposure to the outside world, so many of those hunter-gatherers within that tribe have expanded out into other ways of learning and thinking about things, because they're not limited to that survival function of just doing things, which, if you assume that you have to hunt, and I'm not saying that this is the way that it is or anything, I'm just saying that if I were to philosophize about how the evolution happens from that type of lifestyle to more agricultural, settled down lifestyle, not quite as nomadic and things like that, it would be, maybe meat isn't all there is, maybe honey isn't all there is, or maybe there are different ways of obtaining these things. But if you don't ever venture down that pathway of thinking critically that way, then you're going to continue doing things the same way now that you have for thousands of years. And there is a beauty in that. There is really a beauty in that tradition, but there's also a limiting factor, major limiting factor. Like, for instance, I had always assumed that hunter-gatherers would have really paid attention to the motion of the sun, moon, and stars. This particular tribe did not. When asked, what does the sun and the moon mean to you? They were like, well, you can't hunt when there's a full moon. And that was that. It was just, so I thought that that was really fascinating, because it goes to show that even taking the time to philosophize about the movement of the stars and the moon, or why they're there, or any of those things, actually comes after that hunter-gatherer perspective, or at least that was one of the drawaways that was a potential reality for me watching that. Was like, you wouldn't care two shits about it if you were just trying to get meat and honey. You would have to think differently about certain things and have those needs met in order to be able to move to the next level of philosophy around that. So yeah, I felt like that was a really fascinating take. And it draws back into the whole concept of, if you don't question your reality or question the axioms and think about what else could happen, then you don't go down the road of asking yourself the questions, or trying new things, or experimenting new ways that actually are the evolution of the individual, or are the evolution of that society. So that was a major takeaway for me.
I love that so much. Meat and honey. And when you're saying that, I'm like thinking of all these people who, if you ask them that now, and are really very nuanced and maybe advanced in many ways, culture and society, where you could be, like studying these things that are really amazing and very helpful for people, and very nuanced, take a lot of time, a lot of learning over many years. You could be doing that. Or you could be just like sitting in front of a TV, eating waffles and watching some kind of programming for years and years and gaining all this weight. And, if you ask someone like that, like, what's the purpose of life? Do they even have an answer? I don't know. Like,
Yeah.
I've spent a lot of time asking people, like, what are you here for? What are you doing here? Why are you here? Right? Like, why are you doing this here? And a lot of people don't necessarily have an answer. Or sometimes if they think long and hard about it, they might come back to me like a week later and like, okay, here it is. It's like family and friends and happiness or something. And that's cool. But some people really can't come up with it. And they've just been reacting and just never really like directing or responding, or choosing why or what. And so part of me kind of envies that they even had an answer, as simple as it was. And another part of me is like, yeah, how lucky are we that we have a lot less of those limiting factors like you described, to be able to choose should we want to, whether we just sit on a couch and eat waffles, or whether we go, searching for the mysteries of life and trying to elucidate them and share them with others and figure out what's going on,
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's really what it's all about too. That's what it makes my own life enriching, and others that I see that I perceive as having done or doing great things, or even interesting things, is that they are pursuing the mysteries. If the fabric of reality is made by interweaving strands of, cloth or string or whatever the case is, what is happening in the spaces between those threads? That is the stuff, actually, because there is more space in between the threads than there is actually material of the threads. And so finding all of that really mysterious information has always been something that I think has always intrigued me, and it seems to draw out the best in humanity too, regardless of what subject it is, what mysterious aspect of reality they're looking at. It really seems to extract their consciousness in a really cool way.
It brings you back to like when you were a child, because everything was a mystery, and you're like, ooh, can I like build a tree house with this stuff up in that tree right there? Like, let's find out.
Yeah.
You're like a natural scientist when you're a kid. You're just like running around investigating everything. And that was so enriching and so exciting. And I'm like, well, I never lost that. Like, that's what I'm still doing, right?
Yep.
Just running around saying like, okay, what can we do with this? Or like, how can we think about that? Or how can we move it around and shift it? And what does it do for us when we do? And maybe you leave some of it behind, and maybe some of it becomes like integral to your forward momentum in life. And that's a beautiful thing.
For many years, I studied Gnosticism, Christian Gnosticism. And one of the things that I really liked about that whole period in my life was that I was taking Christian axioms that otherwise I had grown kind of disdainful of, and started to view them in a different light. But what you were just talking about, that childlike kind of investigation and even an innocence about how big the mystery is, and still just trying to wrap your mind around it, is kind of the way that I would interpret Gnostically the concept of only those who see the life through the eyes of a child or through the innocence of a child will be able to pass into heaven. Otherwise, it's like trying to, pass through the eye of a needle. You have a greater chance passing through the eye of a needle than you would passing into heaven. And I think that that's really what it is, that you create your own joy, your own enjoyment, meaning that you're putting joy into what it is that you're doing. That state is very heavenly in and of itself. And it also elevates the consciousness to realms where it can begin to philosophize, and you no longer are identifying just with your physical being, because if you only identify physically, you will die. There's no getting around that. Every physical thing dies, it ebbs and it flows, and that's that. But with more subtle things, consciousness itself, thoughts themselves, ideas themselves, those are able to live on in perpetuity. And that's the thing. If a person can actually elevate their consciousness to that state, then I think that they have achieved immortality. Now, I put a lot of time thinking into things like this, of course, because of the concepts of immortality and alchemy in reading pervading themes like this. But that's kind of where I've arrived to lately with it all.
I love that. And it also seems like that childlike innocence that you required to maintain, in order to get into heaven is also part of that. When you're a kid, when you're very young and you're a child, you don't ever assume you know anything. You might come to a point where you're like, I think I get it. And you're going to go check and see if you do or not, right? Like I thought I had figured out addition because I found out that 1 + 1 = 2, and I knew how to count. And I was like, oh, I get the pattern then. 2 + 2 = 3, and 3 + 3 = 4, and 4. Right, Mom? And she was like, no, that's not it. Like, oh,
really
okay.
good, but not quite.
Good guess. So I think that's part of that too, is if we never get to that point where we assume we know for sure, right, without trying to check or you figure it out or validate it, because that's a lot of where that's like an adult seeming mindset, unfortunately, is like, okay, now we know, now we're adults, this is what it is, and let's move forward with that, instead of saying like, well, I know a lot, but there's a lot that I don't know, and even the things I think I know might not be what I know.
Yeah, exactly. And always willing to do it, which actually gets me to think of a statement that I received quite some shit from, that I made when I was on Middle Path the last time, which was, we were talking about this new COVID vaccine. And I said, well, it's mRNA and it seems to be actually safer in concept. Now,
oh, people freaked out. People wrote me emails. They were like, who is that man? Don't trust him. He's a shill. I'm like, this is my friend, and he's saying what he thinks because he's investigated it. And you don't have to take his ideas. And,
oh man, I received a lot of shit about that too. Somehow people found my personal email address and they were coming after me and, saying all these things. And I had to, gracefully say, basically, look, spike protein isn't normal to human DNA. So if you're going to be putting an mRNA of something that's foreign to human DNA in the system, it's obviously a bad idea. I've also been, I wouldn't
you
even
said
myself
that you wouldn't take it.
I wouldn't take it. I never would. I don't even like the concept of standard vaccines, even though I understand the logic behind how they have come to their answer. But again, they're basing it on an axiom that they don't necessarily know is true. And again, up until 2020, very few people were even on this train that viruses don't exist, et cetera. And only because of Andrew Kaufman and me actually challenging his ideas, he actually posted this thing on Facebook, probably in April or May of 2020, saying, for anybody who says that viruses exist, I want you to show me a single document with the proof of viral isolation. So I found about 20 of them, equine virus isolation and all of these other things. And I submitted them to him and I said, you know, I've read through these. Here's the method that they're using. They outline it in this portion of this peer-reviewed study. This is peer-reviewed by these doctors and so on and so forth. So what do you mean a virus hasn't been isolated? And he says, well, let's walk through this procedure and let me just see if you think that this means isolation. Once he walked me through it, I said, well, no, of course. That's actually a conglomeration, not an isolation. And he says, well, exactly. This is exactly what this looks like. In a single moment of education, I was able to change my entire perspective on it based on data and logical and critical thinking. And the same thing happens to me all the time. So when people ask me, you know, this certain thing or this thing, it's like, well, from where I'm at right now, it seems like here's the idea, here's how it was formulated, here's what has been told about it. And if you can show or demonstrate something different, I have absolutely no ties to this information whatsoever. At present, there's nothing more than conjecture floating around about the spike protein doing this, that, or the other, except they are now showing that for whatever reason, it is creating very specific cardiovascular complications, which seems obvious from the amount of blood clot issues that people have been having. And also that would be the same type of thing when blood clots in Chinese medicine. This is usually due to either dampness, especially if it's happening in the uterus, that would be called dampness in lower jiao, or it happens from liver qi or liver blood stagnation. And so, and liver blood and qi stagnation can happen from dampness in liver and gallbladder as well. It's important to say. So when I take a look at these things, it's like, well, of course, we already knew what was going to happen just based on other things that have happened and categorizations other ways. So this is why I wouldn't take it. But when they want to argue the science with me about what has been proven, it's like, so you have a laboratory and you've clinically proven this, or are you just going on the word of people that you think have information that you haven't actually verified for yourself? Because that's what I'm doing. I have a laboratory, and if they say something is true, I actually have to verify it for myself. I have to either take the sample to a scanning electron microscope up at the university, or I have to use my microscope here in the lab, or I have to run the distillations or try the formula or whatever else. And I also have to run the mathematics, and I have to see if what they're saying can actually be validated, and then shift my perspective on it and see if I can unprove it. And if I can't unprove it, then I have to go with the best data that is available right now, but not because I believe it or even that I necessarily want to teach it, but that's the best data that we have right now. And that's the most logical way to be able to structure one's life, is move from this to this to this. And, you know, most of the people who tore me apart were just crazy into the conspiracy realm anyway, which is funny because I get accused by the mainstream as being a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
well,
so,
and that goes back to that attachment too. You know, I did an episode about all these, reproductive health issues that women are having since the vaccine came out, and it was very disturbing. I was just sharing the stories anecdotally and kind of showing this seems to be really prevalent. I'm experiencing it. Every woman I know. You
can't say that is not a phenomena that happens concurrently with the release of this vaccine. Like that is an actual fact from so many reports.
But when I went then and said, you know, but it could be also maybe something like magnetic radiation that would also attack that area, you know, that type of system. And that could be, we can't count that out. People got mad at me for that.
Me too.
They're like, why are you saying it's not the vaccine? I'm like, I'm not. I'm saying it could be.
Yeah,
this other thing could be both.
I'm saying that we don't know, actually,
right.
But we need to keep our minds open to just jump to the conclusion. This is how people got hung, you know, during the Salem witch trial and got burned at the stake. Is like, you know, you would just take somebody that was saying something that was slightly different and then accuse them and put them on the spit because you don't like what they're saying or how they're saying it. And realistically, it's just I'm in the pursuit of better knowledge all the time. And I spend a lot more time than most people actually looking into things so that I have an educated perspective and I'm not just listening to one echo chamber or group speaking in one particular thing. I want every different stance on this that I possibly can, put it all together, and then actually test what works and what doesn't. And part of that is, say that again.
Oh, well, this is the type of thinking that I think is why shows like mine and probably yours will have the same fate, where there's less people that kind of come along with us as we grow, because so many people want and seem to need someone who will just tell them it is this and here's what you should do about it. And you and I are mostly unwilling to do things like that. I'll say it seems like it could be this, and here's some things that seem to be helping me or other people, and you can try that if you're into it. That's not good enough. People want it's this and here's what you do about it.
Exactly.
And that sort of grandstanding and it's very illogical and it's very unintelligent as far as I'm concerned, but people love it and they need it. They do.
It sells. It sells.
Yeah, it sells.
And so that's fantastic. That's really how you monetize a channel.
I think so. I think so.
Yeah, sadly.
I think so. And I think this is why you look at some of the much bigger, and not all, obviously, but there's some of the much bigger names that they are very like, this is it. That's the answer. Here's the end of the story. Here's what you do. They're very much, if you don't agree with me, you're a shill, or you're wrong, or you're stupid, or this or that. And I'm always saying you should probably be careful of people like that. It's cool. They might have a lot to offer you, but just remember that anyone who is so sure is probably missing some things, like some pieces of the puzzle. Like
exactly, like the axiom may or may not be real at the beginning of this equation.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's absolutely brilliant. And you know, I think that it will only be a short time yet, because people are quickly, actually, in comparison to the entire scope of the rest of my life, and even what I've studied sociologically before, people are really waking up in an interesting way, and they're looking into more information, but they're not looking unbiased into most information. Like they'll hear something about counterculture and they're still allowing their emotions to help them make up their minds.
That's it. Yeah.
It's like, oh, I feel that the vaccine's bad. So these people, what they're saying, I'm going to accept what they're saying as truth and regurgitate that truth. And that's that. Now, somebody like you or I could say, oh yeah, the vaccine doesn't seem like that's going to be effective, or that that's even the best way of going about it. And I don't want to take it. And I think that it's unhealthy for people to do that. That's an opinion. And I think, you know, in my experience, YouTube doesn't like to censor that type of information.
Right.
You know, so when so many people are talking about censorship, I think that it really comes down to the attitude with which things are said and how certain it is. And this whole information versus disinformation, you know, campaign and all of these crusaders that are out there these days, to me, it's really born out of bad logic. We wouldn't need that if people would be more open to just receiving information that challenges their belief system or their set perceptions and presents it in a more scientific testing ground, saying, well, we did this test and this seems to be the result of this test. Now, what does that mean? And philosophize about it. It makes a whole lot more sense to go about things that way. But people need to be educated to even understand that is a logical fallacy that they could fall up against, is just accepting other people or going, you know, making an emotional decision, or any of the other logical fallacies that really exist.
Yeah. Well, and they, you know, a lot of us become identified with it too, right? So we're like, you know, like when I was a communist, part of why I was a communist was I was like, well, this is who I am. I'm a fighter against the system, and I'm a savior of the low and downcast, and I'm a political person, and all these things. And when I finally had to start to like question some of that and let it go, I had to let go of part of those identities that I had also clung to. You know, and it kind of goes both ways when you're doing like a show like this, like us, and we're kind of a public figure. People have their identity, right? And then they're like, okay, does this show match who I am and where I'm going and my identity? But then they also create an identity for you, and it's not necessarily correct, right? And so what happens a lot of times too is people will start watching my show and they're like, oh, I love your content, I love your stuff, and then I'll say something like, well, maybe it's AMF and not vaccine shedding, or maybe it's both. And they're like, you've changed. I'm like, well, I haven't actually. I don't think so, at least. I think I've remained open-minded and able to sort of question things. And maybe you just thought that I was someone who repeated what you believe enough that you liked me. And then I said something you didn't. You had like a cognitive break with it. Like, maybe I haven't changed at all, but so they have their identity and then they have their identity for you. And both of those things should be questioned by all of us all the time, right? Who do I think this person is who I'm talking to? And maybe I don't have the whole story about this person. Probably not. Probably a decade down the road, I might have a pretty full, and even then I might have some holes in that and some mistakes I've made.
Exactly.
It's just very interesting.
It is interesting. It's one of those things that's absolutely crazy. Yeah. Well, we're coming about to the end of our time together on the show today, Lindsey. I want you to tell our listeners where they can find you and your works, and some of the things that you enjoy doing, and anything special about your work that you might be offering right now.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, I have so much, and all of it is at RogueWays.org. And if you go to RogueWays.org, you'll see I have still sort of that blog type thing going on the front page where you can read like random poems and essays and ideas and stuff that I've had. And if you hop over to some of the other pages, you can read about the tarot deck that I use and how I go about tarot readings. You can grab a tarot reading for yourself if it's something that sounds like it will help you sort of reorient or understand the place you're at in life, or maybe get through a hard time. I also do spiritual guidance sessions, which are really intended to be for people who are sort of seeking spiritually to understand experiences they've already had, or to sort of gain new perspective or practices to use in their spiritual life. And so if that sounds like something that you're interested in, I've had a very long, deep, rich spiritual path, which we didn't even touch on today, which includes all kinds of experiences, which I think would be sort of shocking to people. So especially if you've had things, happen that you're struggling to understand, I think that that's a really good choice. And then I also do a ceremony for people who have had sort of a lot going on spiritually and feel like maybe they just need an extra boost to get through some darkness, or to unlayer some of the darkness that tends to cling to us sometimes. So that can be a choice for you if you feel like that calls to you. And then I also have all my books available on that site. They come directly from me with an inscription from me too. And so I usually include a little gift with some of those if you want to support that work that I do. And I do make orgone jewelry and crystal jewelry that come infused with the highest energy and blessing that I can muster for you. So they really carry like an oomph, and people who are sort of energetically sensitive, can really feel that from them. So if that's something that you like, I actually had this really cool thing happen not that long ago where I make orgone earrings too. And a woman who was wearing them said she felt this really high-pitched, this really high-pitched sound come at her from her sort of right side. And she felt just something, and she felt like it was some sort of electromagnetic frequency. And I never claim that my orgone protects from EMF. I just say, it brings good spiritual accumulation of energy and this blessing that it carries. But she felt like it was this electromagnetic thing that was hitting her. The earring actually cracked in half and fell off just suddenly. And this is orgone, so it's
it's a hard composite. Yeah.
So I don't even understand how that physically can happen. But she said she felt like she got this and this happened, and that protected her. It kind of absorbed the bulk of it, and that's what broke it. And I was like, hey, I don't know, man, but that's pretty awesome. Especially if you feel like it protected you, that's a really beautiful thing. So wow. I don't know. Again, I don't make claims, but that is one story that I heard that was just really mind blowing. And I've sort of heard from my own, intuition and what I call my guides that it's more powerful than I think. So I tend to think that could be true. Yeah. But that jewelry and the crystal and stone jewelry is also available. And I think that covers it. That's a lot of what's on the site there. And I would love to offer any listeners to your show, if they want to use the coupon code Alchemi-Culture, then they can get 10% off of anything that I produce directly. There are a few things that come from a third party. A lot of the merch, like t-shirts and phone cases and that stuff, I can't offer discounts on, but everything else, readings, jewelry, any of that stuff, the books, you can grab 10% off of those.
Oh, that is so awesome. That's very, very gracious of you. And I hope those of you out there listening will take advantage of that. Also, just a little plug. Lindsey and RogueWays are also affiliates of Phoenix Aurelius. So if you want to find out a way of supporting us both, then you can actually enter in coupon code RogueWays when you check out, or use any of the links on RogueWays that you have provided in the past, Lindsey, to give you guys a commission for all of the things that people would buy from us anyway. And it's the exact same price. We just give them a cut. So
that's so awesome. Thank you for reminding me of that. Yeah, if you go to rogueways.org, literally every page has links to your products, because I was so excited to be a part of this program. So people can use those links to hop over there and do that.
yeah, exactly. It's not, the last time I looked, it's not anything like buku bucks. I mean, I'm not making buku bucks, so it can't be buku bucks coming in for other people either, but I'm sure it's like little amounts that help every single month to just help fuel the fire, so to speak, of passionate knowledge that you're offering to the world.
That's exactly right. If I try to have all these different methods of getting at least a little bit coming in so that it all combines to be able to support me.
Exactly. Well, that's awesome. Lindsey, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. We have so much more to talk about. During the breaks, we were just like, oh yeah, we'll do another episode on this and this and this. So just like you've had me on RogueWays, half a dozen times or more, we'll probably make that a habit, because we have so many fun crossover points and things to talk about. So this will be the first of many, my friend.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited for this show, and to be on it is a pleasure and an honor. And I'm very excited about our future collaborations as well.
Yeah, me too, as always. Well, Lindsey, thank you so much. Everybody, thank you for listening. If you like this, please be sure to subscribe. Click the little notification bell for every time that we release an episode. Be sure to share this with your friends, get the information out if you like what we're doing. And if you can, try and make a little purchase either of one of our sponsored materials or of things using any of these links here, because that will support not only myself, but also the guests that we have on this show, and continue making content like this for you. So thank you so much for listening. This has been an Alchemi-Culture episode. I'm your host, Phoenix Aurelius. Have a great night.